I never thought a fence would become the most expensive problem of my life. But here I am, standing in my backyard in Gilbert, Arizona, staring at a rotting pile of wood that used to keep my neighbor's aggressive German shepherd out of my yard. The damn thing collapsed 3 weeks ago during a monsoon storm, and now, instead of enjoying my morning coffee in peace, I'm dodging dog droppings and listening to Brenda Patterson screech at me from across the property line about how it's my responsibility to fix it. My name is Owen Crawford, and I've lived in the Saguaro Springs HOA community for 5 years now. When I bought this 3-bedroom ranch-style house, the real estate agent promised me it would be a quiet, well-maintained neighborhood with reasonable HOA fees and minimal drama. What she failed to mention was that Brenda Patterson, a 52-year-old woman with a blonde bob haircut that screams, "Let me speak to your manager," had recently been elected HOA president and was on a power trip that would make dictators jealous. The fence in question wasn't just any fence. It was a shared boundary fence between my property and the common area that the HOA maintained, which included a small dog park and walking path. According to the HOA bylaws, which I'd read cover to cover after the fence collapsed, any shared fence between a homeowner's property and HOA common areas was the responsibility of the HOA to maintain and repair. I'd highlighted the relevant section, taken pictures, and sent 3 certified letters to the HOA board requesting they fulfill their obligation. The response I received was a joke. Brenda had sent me a typed letter on official HOA letterhead claiming that since the fence primarily benefited my property by keeping animals out of my yard, I should pay for half the repairs. The estimated cost: $12,000 for a 100-foot cedar fence with proper footings and gates. She wanted me to fork over $6,000 for something that was explicitly their responsibility. I'm not a confrontational guy by nature. I work as a software engineer for a tech company in Phoenix, and I prefer solving problems with logic and documentation rather than yelling matches. But Brenda had pushed every button I had. After my 4th letter went unanswered, I decided to attend the monthly HOA board meeting to address the issue in person. The meeting was held at the community center on a Tuesday evening in late September. The Arizona heat had finally started to break, and the temperature had dropped to a pleasant 85 degrees by 7 p.m. I walked into the beige-walled meeting room carrying a folder full of documentation. Photographs of the collapsed fence, copies of the HOA bylaws, and my property deed showing exactly where the boundary line fell. Brenda sat at the head of a folding table, flanked by 2 other board members. Gary Henderson, a retired accountant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and Susan Mitchell, a yoga instructor who spent most of the meeting scrolling through her phone. About 15 other homeowners sat in plastic chairs facing the board, most of them looking equally disinterested until I raised my hand during the open forum portion of the meeting. "Yes, Owen," Brenda said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What can we help you with tonight?" I stood up, folder in hand. "I'm here about the shared fence between my property at 4587 Desert Willow Drive and the HOA common area. As you know, it collapsed 3 weeks ago, and despite multiple written requests, the HOA has failed to repair it or even respond with a timeline for repairs." Brenda's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed. "As I explained in my letter to you, Owen, we believe this is a shared responsibility since you benefit from the fence's existence. With all due respect, Brenda, that's not what the bylaws say." I opened my folder and pulled out a highlighted copy. Section 7.3 clearly states that any fence between a homeowner's property and HOA-maintained common areas is the sole responsibility of the HOA for both maintenance and repair. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable here. I'm asking the HOA to follow its own rules. A few homeowners in the audience perked up at this, and I noticed several people nodding. Gary Henderson leaned forward and whispered something to Brenda, who waved him off dismissively. "The board has reviewed your request and denied it," Brenda announced. "We have many other priorities for HOA funds, including resurfacing the community pool and replacing the landscaping at the main entrance. A fence repair for one homeowner isn't a priority." "It's not a fence repair for one homeowner," I countered, trying to keep my voice level. "It's a fence that borders HOA property. And right now, without that fence, the dog park is basically open to my backyard. I've had 3 different dogs come onto my property in the last week alone. One of them destroyed my vegetable garden." "Perhaps you should consider building your own fence then," Brenda suggested. "Many homeowners in this community have privacy fences. There's nothing stopping you from doing the same." I felt my jaw clench. "Except that I shouldn't have to pay for something that's explicitly your responsibility. I'm not asking for a privacy fence. I'm asking you to repair the shared fence that was there when I bought the property, which the HOA installed and maintained until now." Brenda stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. "Your request is denied, Owen. If there's nothing else, we need to move on to other agenda items." I looked around the room, hoping someone would speak up, but everyone avoided my gaze. These people had seen enough of Brenda's vindictive streak to know better than to cross her. I'd heard stories about homeowners who'd challenged her authority and found themselves slapped with petty violation notices for things like garbage cans being visible from the street or mailbox colors being half a shade off from approved tones. "Fine," I said, gathering my papers. "I'll handle this another way." I left the meeting fuming and drove home in silence, my mind racing through options. I could sue the HOA, but that would cost thousands in legal fees with no guarantee of success. I could file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, but that process could take months. Or I could do something that was perfectly legal but would make my point crystal clear. Over the next few days, I did extensive research on property law in Arizona. I consulted with a real estate attorney named Marcus Webb, paying him $300 for an hour-long consultation in his Scottsdale office. Marcus was a guy in his 40s with a reputation for being straightforward and knowledgeable about HOA disputes. "So let me get this straight," Marcus said, leaning back in his leather chair. "The fence is on the property line between your lot and the HOA common area. The HOA installed it and maintained it for years. And now they're refusing to repair it even though their own bylaws say it's their responsibility." "Exactly," I confirmed. "I've documented everything. I have emails, certified letters, photographs, the works." Marcus nodded slowly. "Here's the thing about shared fences in Arizona. If a fence sits directly on a property line and was installed as a shared fence, both parties are typically responsible for maintenance unless there's a specific agreement or bylaw stating otherwise. In your case, you have that specific bylaw. So I can sue them." "You could, but HOA litigation is expensive and time-consuming. Most HOAs have deeper pockets than individual homeowners, and they'll drag it out just to make you give up." He paused, tapping his pen on his desk. "But there is another option, though it's a bit unconventional." "I'm listening." "If the fence sits on the property line, you technically own half of it. The HOA owns the other half. If they're refusing to maintain their portion, and the fence is damaged beyond reasonable repair, you have every right to remove your half of the fence. You're not obligated to leave your portion of a damaged structure in place. I blinked. You're saying I can just remove my half of the fence? Technically, yes. As long as you're only removing the portion that sits on your property and you're not damaging their half, you're within your rights. Now, would I normally recommend this? No, because it tends to escalate conflicts. But if you've exhausted all other reasonable options and you're trying to make a point, it's legal. A smile slowly spread across my face. And if I remove my half, what happens to their half? Marcus grinned. Without your support posts and panels, their half would be pretty useless. You'd effectively create gaps in the fence wherever your portion was removed. It would make their dog park area virtually unusable, which might motivate them to actually fix the problem. I left Marcus's office with a plan. I spent the next week preparing, measuring out exactly where my property line fell. I hired a surveyor to come out and mark the boundaries with stakes and bright orange string, costing me $500, but giving me legal certainty about what was mine. The surveyor confirmed that the fence posts alternated, with every other post on my property and the panels split between both properties. I also documented everything. I took videos and photographs from every angle, showing the current state of the collapsed fence and the property line markers. I sent one final certified letter to the HOA, explaining my intentions in clear, legally precise language. I stated that due to the HOA's refusal to repair the shared fence as required by the bylaws, and given the safety concerns caused by the collapsed fence, I would be exercising my property rights to remove my portion of the damaged fence from my property. I gave them 7 days to respond. Brenda's response arrived via email 4 days later. It was short and dismissive. The HOA board has reviewed your threat and finds it baseless. You are not authorized to touch HOA property, and any attempt to remove or damage the fence will result in legal action and fines. Furthermore, you are required to maintain your property in accordance with community standards, which includes proper boundary fencing. The contradiction in her message would have been funny if it wasn't so infuriating. She was simultaneously claiming the fence was HOA property while also saying I was required to have boundary fencing. But her email gave me all the ammunition I needed. She'd been warned, and she'd chosen to ignore the warning. I called a demolition and hauling company called Arizona Cleanup Services, explaining what I needed. The owner, a guy named Rick Chavez, was intrigued by the whole situation. "So you're just removing your half of the fence?" Rick asked over the phone. "Exactly. I've had a surveyor mark my property line, and I only want the portions that are on my property removed. Everything on the HOA side stays untouched. And you've got all the documentation proving this is legal. I've got a lawyer's blessing, survey results, and a paper trail a mile long showing I tried to resolve this properly." Rick laughed. "Man, I've seen some HOA horror stories, but this is a new one. Yeah, we can do it. Give me a day to get a crew together and we'll have it done in an afternoon." We scheduled the removal for the following Saturday. I took the day off work, making sure I'd be home to oversee everything and document the process. I also sent courtesy emails to my immediate neighbors, explaining what was happening and why. Most of them responded with sympathy, having dealt with Brenda's nonsense themselves. Saturday morning arrived with clear blue skies and a temperature that promised to hit 95 by afternoon. Rick showed up at 8 a.m. with a crew of 4 guys and a large truck. I met them in my driveway, property survey and documentation in hand. "All right, Owen, show us what we're working with," Rick said, adjusting his work gloves. We walked to the backyard where the orange string marked my property line with precision. I showed Rick and his crew exactly which posts and panels were on my property versus the HOA's side. "We'll need to be careful with the posts," Rick noted. "Some of them are shared, sitting right on the line. We can cut those at ground level on your side without disturbing their side." "Whatever you think is best," I said. "I just want my half gone." The crew got to work with saws, crowbars, and sledgehammers. The fence was old cedar, already rotted in places from years of Arizona sun and monsoon moisture, so it came apart relatively easily. Within an hour, they'd removed the first section of panels from my side, leaving the HOA's panels standing but without the support they'd previously had from my posts. That's when Brenda showed up. I'd been expecting her, honestly. I'm sure one of her flying monkeys had called her the moment they saw the truck pull up. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, storming across the common area toward my property. She was wearing a white visor, pink athletic wear, and oversized sunglasses, looking like she'd been interrupted during her morning power walk. I walked to the property line, careful not to step onto HOA property. "Good morning, Brenda. I'm removing my portion of the damaged fence from my property, exactly as I stated in my certified letter last week." "You can't do that. That's HOA property." "Actually, it's not." I pulled out a folded copy of the survey. I had a professional surveyor mark the property line. "Everything my crew is removing sits on my property. I own it and I'm entitled to remove it." Brenda's face turned a shade of red that clashed horribly with her pink outfit. "This is vandalism. I'm calling the police." "Please do," I said calmly. "I have all my documentation ready to show them, including the survey, property deed, HOA bylaws, and the letter from my attorney confirming this is legal." She sputtered for a moment, then pulled out her phone and dialed 911. I caught Rick's eye, and he gave me a thumbs up. His crew continued working, unbothered by the drama. 2 Gilbert police officers arrived about 20 minutes later. I recognized one of them, Officer Tom Bradley, who lived in a neighboring community and had responded to a break-in attempt at my house a year earlier. "Morning, Mr. Crawford," Officer Bradley said, approaching with his partner, a younger officer named Sarah Reeves. "We got a call about property destruction." "Morning, officers. No property destruction happening here. I'm removing my portion of a damaged fence from my property." I handed Officer Bradley my folder of documentation. "I've got the property survey showing the boundary line, my deed, and a letter from my real estate attorney confirming I'm within my rights." Brenda pushed forward, her voice shrill. "He's destroying HOA property. He's violating community rules." Officer Bradley held up a hand. "Madam, let me review the documentation first." He spent several minutes looking through my papers, walking the property line to compare the survey stakes with what the crew was removing. Officer Reeves spoke with Rick and his crew, verifying what they were doing. Finally, Officer Bradley returned to where Brenda and I stood on opposite sides of the property line. "Mr. Crawford is correct. He's only removing fence materials from his property. The survey is legitimate, and he's not touching anything on HOA property." "But he can't just leave gaps in the fence," Brenda protested. "That's an HOA matter, not a police matter," Officer Reeves said. "If you have a dispute about property maintenance or HOA rules, you'll need to handle that through civil channels." Brenda looked like she might explode. "This is ridiculous. You're not going to do anything." "There's nothing to do," Officer Bradley said patiently. "No crime is being committed. Have a good day, folks." The officers left, and Brenda stood there seething. "You're going to regret this, Owen. The HOA will fine you for every day you don't have a proper fence. We'll put a lien on your property. We'll make your life miserable." The bylaws state that boundary fences between homeowner property and HOA common areas are the HOA's responsibility, I replied. If you fine me for not having a fence that you're required to provide, I'll see you in court, and I'll win. I've got 5 years of HOA fees paid in full, documentation of your refusal to maintain the shared fence, and proof that I've tried to resolve this reasonably. Any judge will side with me. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time since I'd met her, Brenda Patterson was speechless. She spun on her heel and marched back toward the community center, her phone already pressed to her ear. Rick and his crew finished the job by 2 p.m. My half of the fence was gone, hauled away in Rick's truck to be disposed of properly. What remained was a bizarre sight. Sections of fence panels standing on the HOA side, but without the support posts and alternating panels from my side, they were essentially useless. There were gaps every 8 feet where my panels had been, making the entire dog park area look like a mouth missing half its teeth. I paid Rick his fee of $800, which included disposal costs, and watched his truck disappear down the street. Then I stood in my backyard and admired my handiwork. The gap wasn't pretty, but it proved my point perfectly. Without my cooperation and without the HOA fulfilling their responsibility, there was no functional fence. The fallout started almost immediately. By Sunday morning, I'd received 3 emails from different homeowners asking what happened to the fence. I replied to each one with a detailed explanation, including copies of my documentation and the HOA's refusal to repair the shared fence. I made sure to emphasize that I'd tried for weeks to resolve this properly before taking action. By Monday, the HOA had sent out a community-wide email. Brenda's message claimed that a rogue homeowner had vandalized community property and that the board was exploring all legal options. The email conveniently left out any mention of the collapsed fence, the HOA's responsibility under the bylaws, or the months of documented requests I'd sent. I replied to the community email with my own message, hitting Reply All to ensure everyone saw it. I laid out the entire timeline, attached photographs of the collapsed fence and the property survey, quoted the relevant bylaws, and included copies of my unanswered letters to the HOA. I explained that I'd only removed my portion of the fence after exhausting all reasonable options and being threatened by the HOA president. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, I'd received supportive messages from dozens of homeowners who'd had their own nightmares dealing with Brenda. One couple, the Martins, had been fined $3,000 for painting their house trim a color that was supposedly unauthorized, even though it was listed on the approved color palette. Another homeowner, Jeff Rodriguez, had been cited for having an unapproved vehicle in his driveway, which turned out to be a work van he needed for his plumbing business. An emergency HOA meeting was called for that Wednesday evening. The community center was packed, with over 60 homeowners crammed into a space designed for 30. I arrived 15 minutes early and found myself surrounded by neighbors wanting to shake my hand and hear the full story. Brenda called the meeting to order, banging a gavel like she was a judge presiding over a trial. We're here tonight to address the serious violation committed by Owen Crawford, who deliberately destroyed HOA property and created a safety hazard in our community. Before she could continue, a man in his 60s named Robert Sullivan stood up. Robert was a retired attorney who'd lived in Saguaro Springs longer than anyone else. Point of order, Brenda. Before we discuss any alleged violations, I'd like to hear Owen's side of the story. And I'd like to review the bylaws regarding shared fence maintenance. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, Brenda's jaw tightened, but she couldn't refuse without looking even worse. "Fine. Owen, would you like to explain yourself?" I stood up, my folder in hand once again. For the next 10 minutes, I walked the entire room through everything that had happened. I showed photographs of the collapsed fence. I read relevant sections of the bylaws. I displayed the property survey results. I shared the timeline of my unanswered letters and Brenda's dismissive responses. I explained the legal consultation I'd had and the careful documentation of the fence removal. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then Robert Sullivan spoke up again. "Brenda, is it true that the HOA received multiple requests from Owen to repair this fence and refused?" Brenda shifted in her seat. "The board determined it wasn't a priority expense. But the bylaws clearly state it's an HOA responsibility," another homeowner called out. "We have limited funds," Brenda snapped. "We can't just throw money at every little problem." $12,000 to repair a fence that's an HOA responsibility isn't a little problem, I interjected. Especially when the HOA just spent $30,000 on new landscaping at the entrance that nobody asked for. That comment sparked an uproar. Multiple homeowners started talking at once, some demanding to know why the landscaping had been prioritized over safety issues, others questioning the board's financial decisions. Gary Henderson, the treasurer, looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Robert Sullivan raised his voice to be heard over the chaos. "I move that we hold a vote of no confidence in the current HOA board, effective immediately, and establish a special committee to review all board decisions made in the past year." Second, at least 10 voices called out simultaneously. Brenda's face had gone from red to pale. "You can't do that." "Actually, we can," Robert said. "It's in the HOA bylaws, section 12.4. Any group of homeowners representing at least 20% of the community can call for a vote of no confidence. I count at least 60 people in this room, which is well over 20% of our 180 homes." The vote was overwhelming. Of the 63 homeowners present, 58 voted to remove the current board from power. Only 5 people voted to keep them, and I suspected most of those were Brenda's personal friends. An interim board was established that night, with Robert Sullivan serving as temporary president. One of their first actions was to pass a motion allocating funds to properly repair the shared fence between my property and the HOA common area, and to do so within 30 days. Brenda stood up, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the meeting without another word. Susan Mitchell, the yoga instructor board member, looked relieved to be done with the whole thing. Gary Henderson approached me after the meeting ended. "I owe you an apology," Gary said, extending his hand. "I knew Brenda was wrong about the fence, but I didn't have the spine to stand up to her. She's been running roughshod over this community for 2 years, and nobody wanted to be her next target." I shook his hand. "I get it. She's intimidating, but someone had to push back." "Well, you did more than push back. You knocked down her whole house of cards." Over the next month, things moved quickly. The new interim board hired an independent auditor to review the HOA's finances. What they found was alarming. While there was no evidence of outright theft, Brenda had been approving expenses without proper board votes, directing contracts to companies owned by her friends and family members, and charging the HOA for personal expenses disguised as community relations costs. The total amount of questionable spending exceeded $40,000. The board filed a civil lawsuit against Brenda Patterson for breach of fiduciary duty and misuse of HOA funds. They also reported their findings to the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which had authority over HOA management. I stayed out of that fight, Having achieved what I needed to achieve, true to their word, the interim board hired a reputable fencing company called Desert Fence Solutions. The owner, a straightforward guy named Paul Morrison, came out to assess the situation. He took one look at the remaining sections of the old fence and shook his head. "This whole thing needs to come down and be rebuilt from scratch," Paul said. "The wood's rotted through in multiple places, the posts are compromised, and frankly, it's a miracle it stood as long as it did." The interim board approved his quote of $14,000 for a complete replacement. The new fence would be 6 feet tall, made of composite material designed to withstand Arizona's harsh weather, and built to last at least 20 years. Paul's crew started work in early November when the weather had cooled to comfortable temperatures. I watched from my back patio as they tore down the remaining sections of the old fence and installed proper footings for the new posts. The work took about a week, and the result was impressive. The new fence was solid, attractive, and most importantly, it created a proper boundary between my property and the HOA common area. Paul came to my door on the final day of installation. "Just wanted to let you know we're done. The gate access to the dog park is on the HOA side, so you shouldn't be bothered by any dogs wandering onto your property anymore." "Thanks, Paul. It looks great," he grinned. "You know, I've been installing fences in the valley for 15 years, and I've heard some crazy HOA stories. But this one takes the cake. You actually got them to do the right thing by taking away their fence." "Sometimes you have to make a point in a way people can't ignore," I said. Life in Saguaro Springs settled into a new normal over the following months. The permanent board elections were held in January, and Robert Sullivan was elected president by a landslide. The new board immediately set about reversing many of Brenda's policies, including the ridiculous violation notices she'd issued for petty nonsense. Brenda herself seemed to vanish from community life. I'd see her occasionally, getting into her car or checking her mailbox, but she never made eye contact and certainly never spoke to me. According to neighborhood gossip, she'd been forced to settle the civil lawsuit by paying back $20,000 to the HOA and covering the legal fees. The Arizona Department of Real Estate had also barred her from serving on any HOA board for 5 years. The story spread beyond Saguaro Springs. A local news station picked it up after one of my neighbors sent them a tip. A reporter named Jennifer Walsh came out to interview me for a segment on HOA disputes. The piece aired in February, focusing on the importance of knowing your property rights and HOA bylaws. Jennifer described my fence removal as a creative solution to bureaucratic obstruction, which made me laugh. After the news segment aired, I received calls from 3 other homeowners in different HOA communities around the Phoenix metro area, all dealing with similar fence disputes. I shared my documentation and the name of my attorney, Marcus Webb, who apparently gained several new clients from the publicity, but the real satisfaction came from the small, everyday improvements in the neighborhood. Without Brenda's reign of terror, people seemed happier. The neighborhood pool became a social hub again, instead of a place people avoided to escape violation notices. Kids played in the streets without parents worrying about getting cited for chalk drawings on the sidewalk. The community started feeling like an actual community. One Saturday evening in March, my neighbor Tom Henderson hosted a backyard barbecue and invited half the street. I was standing by the grill, beer in hand, when Robert Sullivan approached me. "Owen, I wanted to thank you properly," Robert said. "What you did with that fence, it was gutsy. Most people would have just paid the money or suffered in silence. I just couldn't let it go," I admitted. "The principle of the thing bothered me more than the money." Well, your principle sparked a revolution. This community is in a better place because you stood your ground. He raised his beer bottle in a toast. To property lines and proper documentation. I clinked my bottle against his. And to fences that actually work. As the evening wore on and neighbors laughed and shared stories around Tom's fire pit, I found myself reflecting on the entire experience. The fence dispute had cost me time, energy, and about $1,500 in surveyor fees, documentation costs, and legal consultation. But it had also shown me the power of knowing your rights and being willing to use them. The new fence stood solid and strong in my backyard, a physical reminder that sometimes the most effective way to solve a problem isn't confrontation or compromise, but removing your half of the equation and letting the other side deal with the consequences. Brenda had assumed I'd cave to her pressure, that I'd eventually pay for the fence just to avoid conflict. She'd underestimated my stubbornness and my belief that rules should apply to everyone, including the people making them. My vegetable garden, which had been trampled by wandering dogs during the fence gap period, was thriving again. I'd replanted tomatoes, peppers, and squash, and they were already showing promising growth. On Sunday mornings, I'd take my coffee out to the patio and enjoy the peace and quiet, knowing that the fence was exactly where it should be and doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The whole experience taught me valuable lessons about HOA living. First, always read your bylaws thoroughly and keep a copy accessible. Second, document everything in writing, especially when dealing with people who might later deny conversations or agreements. Third, know your property boundaries with legal certainty. That $500 survey was the best money I spent during the entire dispute. Fourth, don't be afraid to stand up to bullies, even when they have official titles and apparent authority. Most importantly, I learned that communities work best when everyone follows the same rules and when people in leadership positions act with integrity. Brenda's downfall wasn't really caused by my fence removal. It was caused by her own corruption and abuse of power. The fence issue simply brought everything to light in a way that couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug. The civil case against Brenda concluded in April with a final settlement. In addition to the $20,000 she'd already paid, she agreed to cover the cost differential between the old fence repair estimate and the new fence installation. That extra $2,000 went into the HOA's reserve fund, which the new board was carefully rebuilding after discovering how depleted it had become under Brenda's management. I attended the HOA meeting where the settlement was announced. The room erupted in applause when Robert Sullivan read the terms. Justice, it seemed, had been served not through dramatic courtroom theatrics, but through persistent documentation, community involvement, and the simple application of rules that were already written down. As spring turned to summer and Arizona's temperatures climbed back into the triple digits, I started noticing small improvements throughout Saguaro Springs. The new board had used the settlement money and carefully allocated HOA funds to address deferred maintenance issues. Streetlights that had been burned out for months were replaced. The community pool received necessary repairs to its filtration system. Several common area fences, not just mine, were inspected and reinforced where needed. Jeff Rodriguez, the plumber who'd been cited for his work van, was awarded a contract to update the irrigation systems for the common areas, saving the HOA money by using a local professional instead of Brenda's overpriced out-of-state contractors. The Martins, who'd been fined for their paint color, received a formal apology and a refund of their fine. In June, I received an unexpected visit from Marcus Webb, my real estate attorney. He showed up at my door on a Saturday morning, looking more casual than he had in his office, wearing jeans and a polo shirt. "Marcus, what brings you by?" I asked, inviting him in from the heat. "I wanted to show you something," he said, pulling out his tablet. "Remember how your case made the news? Well, it's making waves in the legal community too. I'm writing an article for the Arizona Bar Association Journal about creative property rights solutions in HOA disputes, and your fence removal is the centerpiece example." He showed me the draft article, which was technically detailed, but highlighted how I'd used existing legal frameworks rather than filing expensive lawsuits. "The point I'm making is that homeowners often have more power than they realize, but they need to do their homework and understand property law." "Are you going to mention me by name?" I asked. "Only if you're comfortable with it. I can keep you anonymous if you prefer." I thought about it for a moment. "No, use my name. If it helps other people dealing with similar situations, I'm fine with that." The article was published in August and apparently became one of the most read pieces in the journal's history. Marcus told me he'd been invited to speak at a conference about HOA law reform, using my case as an example of why clearer regulations and better enforcement mechanisms were needed. Meanwhile, life in Saguaro Springs continued to improve. The neighborhood organized a community yard sale in September, something that hadn't happened in years because Brenda had considered them tacky and refused to approve them. Over 40 families participated, and the streets were filled with people browsing items, chatting with neighbors, and actually enjoying the community they lived in. I sold some old furniture and electronics, making a couple $100, but the real value was the conversations. I met people I'd never talked to before, heard their own stories about dealing with HOA nonsense under the old board, and realized how widespread the problems had been. My fence dispute had been the catalyst, but the rot had gone much deeper. Tom Henderson pulled me aside during the yard sale. "Hey, Owen, I never told you this, but Brenda tried to get me to vote against you at that emergency meeting. She called me the day before, said you were trying to destroy the community, and that I should speak out against you. What did you say?" "I told her I'd reviewed the bylaws and you were right. She hung up on me." He laughed. "Best phone call I ever had. She never bothered me again after that." As October arrived and the weather finally started cooling off again, marking a full year since the fence collapsed, I realized how much had changed. The new board had established better communication channels, including a community Facebook group and monthly newsletters. Financial reports were posted online for anyone to review. Board meetings were recorded and archived. The culture of secrecy and intimidation that Brenda had cultivated was gone, replaced by transparency and actual community governance. Robert Sullivan announced he wouldn't seek re-election when his interim term ended, citing his age and a desire to spend more time with his grandchildren. But he'd helped establish a strong foundation for whoever came next. Several qualified candidates emerged, including a property manager, a small business owner, and a retired civil engineer. All of them ran on platforms of continued transparency and fiscal responsibility. I didn't run for the board myself. I'm not really a leadership guy, and my work schedule wouldn't allow for the time commitment. But I did volunteer to join the Architectural Review Committee, helping to update the community's design guidelines to be more reasonable and less arbitrary. We eliminated dozens of nitpicky rules that had existed solely to generate violation fees and established clear, objective standards for things like exterior paint colors, landscaping requirements, and vehicle parking. The holidays came and went. The neighborhood organized a Christmas light contest that was actually fun instead of stressful, with prizes for creativity rather than citations for violations. I didn't win, but my simple string of white lights and a modest inflatable snowman earned compliments from several neighbors who appreciated the understated approach. In January, exactly 1 year after the emergency meeting that had removed Brenda from power, the community held its regular elections. I voted for the retired civil engineer, a woman named Patricia Hughes, who had a reputation for practical problem solving. She won easily and immediately got to work implementing smart policies that balanced community standards with individual property rights. One evening in February, I was out working in my garden when I heard someone call my name. I looked up to see Brenda standing on the HOA side of the fence, the sturdy composite barrier between us. "Owen," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "Can we talk?" I set down my trowel and walked over, keeping the fence between us. "What's on your mind, Brenda?" She looked older than I remembered, worn down by the past year. I wanted to say that I'm sorry for how I handled everything with the fence and for how I treated a lot of people in this community. I studied her face, looking for signs of insincerity, but she seemed genuine. "What brought this on?" "Therapy, mostly," she admitted. "And a lot of time to think. I was dealing with some personal stuff when I was HOA president. My marriage was falling apart. My kids had moved away, and I think I used the power of the position to feel like I had control over something. I made a lot of mistakes." "That's putting it mildly," I said, but without venom. "I know. I cost myself friends, respect, and a lot of money. The lawsuit settlement was financially devastating. But more than that, I lost sight of why HOAs exist in the first place. They're supposed to help maintain the community, not give someone a petty dictatorship. So why are you telling me this?" "Because you were right. About the fence, about the bylaws, about calling me out when I was abusing my position. I hated you for it at the time, but looking back, you did what someone needed to do." She paused. "I'm moving in a few months, selling the house and relocating to Prescott to be closer to my daughter. I just wanted to clear the air before I left." I nodded slowly. "I appreciate you saying that, Brenda, genuinely. It takes guts to admit when you're wrong." "Well, I had plenty of time to learn that lesson." She gave a small, sad smile. "Enjoy the garden, Owen, and take care of this place. It's a good community, even if I forgot that for a while." She walked away, and I returned to my tomato plants. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated by her apology. Mostly, I just felt tired. The whole fence saga had been exhausting, from the initial collapse to the documentation battles to the community upheaval. But it had also been necessary and ultimately worthwhile. Spring arrived with its brief window of perfect Arizona weather before summer's heat returned. My garden flourished, yielding more tomatoes, peppers, and squash than I could eat alone. I started leaving baskets of vegetables on neighbors' doorsteps, a small way of giving back to the community that had supported me during the fence dispute. Marcus Webb called in late March with news that his Bar Association article had sparked interest from a publisher. They wanted him to write a book about HOA disputes and property rights, using real-world case studies. "I'd like to include a full chapter on your fence situation, really dive into the details. Would you be willing to be interviewed more extensively?" "Sure," I said. "If it helps people, I'm all for it." The interview process was more involved than I expected, with Marcus asking detailed questions about my thought process, emotional state, and decision-making at each stage of the dispute. He was particularly interested in the moment I decided to actually remove the fence, the point where frustration turned into action. "What made you confident enough to go through with it?" Marcus asked during one of our phone conversations. I think it was the combination of being absolutely certain I was right legally and being fed up enough that I didn't care about the social consequences, I explained. I'd done the research, consulted with you, gotten the survey done. I knew I was on solid ground. And at that point, Brenda had pushed me past caring whether she liked me or not. That's the key thing many homeowners struggle with, Marcus observed. They know they're right, but they're afraid of retaliation or becoming the neighborhood pariah. They don't realize that bullies like Brenda often have a lot less support than they appear to have. His book was published the following year, titled Standing Your Ground, A Homeowner's Guide to HOA Disputes and Property Rights. My fence story occupied Chapter 7, told in detail with photographs, documentation excerpts, and legal analysis. The book became a minor bestseller in real estate and legal circles, and Marcus sent me a signed copy with a note. Thanks for being willing to fight the good fight, and for letting me share your story. As for me, I continued living in Saguaro Springs, enjoying the community it had become rather than fleeing from what it had been. The new board, under Patricia Hughes' leadership, maintained the positive changes. HOA fees were adjusted to actually cover necessary maintenance rather than vanity projects. Violation notices became rare and were only issued for legitimate safety or severe aesthetic issues. People started volunteering for committees and attending meetings, engaged in their community's governance rather than afraid of it. The fence stood strong through monsoons and heat waves, exactly as Paul Morrison had promised. It fulfilled its purpose perfectly, providing a clear, solid boundary between private property and community space. Sometimes I'd stand on my patio and look at it, remembering the rotted mess that had started everything, and I'd smile. That fence represented more than just property division. It represented the principle that rules matter, that documentation and persistence can overcome corruption, and that sometimes the most effective protest is simply removing your participation from a broken system. 2 years after the original fence collapsed, I was featured in a local magazine article about HOA reform in Arizona. The reporter asked me if I'd do anything differently if I could go back and handle the situation again. Honestly, no, I said. I tried to do things properly first. Multiple letters, attending meetings, following the correct procedures. Only when all of that failed did I take more dramatic action. And even then, I made sure everything I did was legal and documented. I wouldn't change a thing. Do you have any advice for other homeowners dealing with difficult HOAs? Know your rights, read your bylaws, document everything, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. Most HOA disputes happen because homeowners don't realize they have power and legal protections. And if your HOA leadership is truly corrupt or abusive, remember that you're part of a community. Chances are you're not the only one frustrated with how things are being run. Find allies, organize, and use the democratic processes built into your HOA structure. The article ran with a photo of me standing in front of my fence, arms crossed, with a satisfied expression. The caption read, "Owen Crawford proved that sometimes the best way to build bridges is to first remove a fence." Life settled into comfortable routine. My career continued to progress. I got promoted to senior software engineer with a nice salary bump. I dated occasionally, but wasn't in any rush to settle down. My garden became locally famous among neighbors for producing amazing tomatoes, which I attributed to the Arizona sun and stubbornness, translating well to both plants and people. Brenda did move to Prescott, as she'd mentioned. The house sold quickly to a young family with 3 kids, who immediately became active, positive members of the community. The husband, Danny Ortiz even joined the HOA board a year later and proved to be excellent with managing maintenance schedules and vendor contracts. Every time I see that fence, I think about the principle it represents. Not just property rights or HOA bylaws, but the broader idea that systems only work when people follow established rules and when there are consequences for those who don't. Brenda had operated for years assuming she was untouchable, that homeowners would grumble but ultimately comply with whatever she decided. The fence dispute shattered that assumption and revealed that power in a community ultimately rests with its members, not with whoever happens to hold a title. And in the end, that's what made the whole exhausting experience worthwhile. Not the personal vindication or even the financial settlement, but knowing that Saguaro Springs became a better place for everyone because someone finally said enough and backed it up with action. The fence was just wood and composite material, but it became a symbol of standing up to petty tyranny and winning through preparation, documentation, and the courage to follow through. 3 years after everything started, I hosted a backyard barbecue of my own, inviting the neighbors who'd supported me throughout the fence saga. Robert Sullivan was there, as were Tom Henderson, Jeff Rodriguez, the Martins, and about 20 others. We ate grilled burgers and vegetables from my garden, drank cold beer, and told stories as the Arizona sun set in brilliant orange and purple across the desert sky. At one point, someone proposed a toast to Owen, who taught us all that sometimes you have to tear something down before you can build something better. Glasses clinked, and I felt genuinely grateful for this community and these people. The fence still stood behind us, solid and functional, doing its job without fanfare or drama. Just as it should be. That's the thing about fences, I realized. They work best when everyone respects what they represent. Clear boundaries, shared responsibilities, and the understanding that good neighbors don't need a fence to be good neighbors. They need a fence so they can be good neighbors without boundaries becoming sources of conflict. As the evening wore on, and stars began appearing in the darkening sky, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent during those chaotic months of fence battles and HOA drama. Sometimes standing your ground means literally removing the ground from under someone else's feet, or in this case, removing half a fence to prove a point. And sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen for things to get better. The story of my fence dispute with the Saguaro Springs HOA became local legend, a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and a success story about homeowner advocacy. But for me, it was simpler than that. It was about a fence that needed fixing, an HOA that refused to do its job, and one stubborn software engineer who decided he'd had enough. And you know what? The new fence works perfectly. The dog park stays on the HOA side, my garden stays on my side, and everyone's happy. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones, even if getting there requires removing a few obstacles along the way. As I locked up after my guests left and took one final look at the fence before heading to bed, I smiled. Tomorrow I'd wake up, make my coffee, and sit on my patio in peace, enjoying my property and my community. The fence would be there, standing strong, a permanent reminder that knowing your rights and being willing to use them can change everything. And really, what more could you ask for from a fence?